as I was saying, so it's mainly about volunteers' contribution and the valuation. So when I first started thinking about my research work last year, and the first thing I was thinking, personally, I'm an accountant. I'm working in a CA firm. And then I was thinking that, okay, non-profit organizations, volunteers, valuation, where does it go and where it is, and what's the current situation, what are the activities thinking, and is there a valuation there, and all those things. So first of all, I'm going to talk about a bit of background of the whole work based on a bit of, I suppose, literature. To start with a bit of statistics, according to the Volunteering Australia's report in 2022 February, volunteers contributed 596.2 million hours to the community in 2019. And according to Giving Australia, that's in the same report. Total number of volunteers was 5.8 million across all ages. Now, all these volunteers, they are obviously such a large number. They add a lot of value to the non-profit organizations in many ways. Many of the academics have been talking about this for the last decade or so, and obviously I'm not being able to go through everything, but some of the key things that I want to point out as a background is that, first of all, Julian wrote this paper by these authors. They discuss the importance of volunteers in terms of sustainability. So volunteers' contribution, many of the organizations, as per their research, is that they depend on the sustainability of the organization. So if there's no volunteers, they will probably struggle to survive, not short. And the second one is the paper, which Marion published in 2018. They, according to them, the volunteers play quite a role and it's value to the organizations and contribute to the development of products and services which the end beneficiaries they experience. Without them, obviously, that the whole point of the whole objective of the non-profit organizations goes nowhere. So again, long story short, we need the volunteers for those objectives to be met. Lastly, MOOC, who has been very vocal about the valuation of volunteers' contribution, although mainly from Canada, and this study was also in Canada, posits that the contribution from volunteers in terms of time and effort as this organization being on the overhead cost. So first of all, sustainability, and then achieving goals, and then minimum the cost. So all these things gives a bit of, I suppose, base to acknowledge the value that volunteers put through for the organizations. Again, a bit of statistics as well. And this is where costs of valuation part, I believe, in the national account in Australia, volunteers had an included value of 70.2 billion in 2012-13. Although we don't have the very latest data, unfortunately, but although that figure is actually from the 2022 report. And all the other countries where we can probably see that they don't actually do this kind of valuation, even in the national level. I think Canada, Australia, and then a couple of more countries, they don't do it. And that's in the national level, that's in the national account, and they do it on the basis of investment cost method. Whereas your syndical value is if you actually work on a wage basis. So our monthly wage. So, but in an organizational level, according to the academics in the last few years, is that there's a very lack of suppose intention and also objective to report volunteers' contribution in the financial reports. um, later on evaluated in some way. So, but the thing is, maintaining and managing volunteers incurs a cost in an organization, while volunteers generate intrinsic value. So, my study, what I'm trying to bring out is to understand the perception of the stakeholders, key stakeholders, as in donors and say board objectives, what they think about the valuation of volunteers' contribution, if there is a certain merit to it, and if that is true, then what's next? Based on my literature here, and again, trying to summarize in a short way. Some of the literature, they acknowledge the value again. So, as you can see, the merits of adding value of volunteers in the financial accounts has been acknowledged by the New Zealand not-for-profit financial reporting guide. They do give a bit of guidance. So as AASB, as you can see here, is that the 105 it says gives a bit of guidance, but you have to do the valuation based on fair value. Now, they do give the guidance, but the end result is that even though there is guidance and everything, it's because of the nature of volunteers' contribution, and obviously not being a for-profit organization anyway, so how do you actually get an exchange value, market value, fair value, whatever it's called? So it's difficult to measure. It's also difficult to keep record for the volunteers, and it is also, I suppose, more costly than the benefit that you actually get from keeping the records and do the valuation. Many of the organizations also, they don't even think about it. It's just probably it's just too much, and they and there are many other. It's a complex thing. There are many other variables coming here, like many of the organizations in the literature have found that they say that, well, why would I actually do the evaluation? What's the purpose? And what it is at the end of the day, they just need acknowledgement and blah, blah, all those other many other variables. But again, we have also taken discussion on nuance. The literature here by Goran and Norway, I wanted to point it out that they say that the absence and reasons of the absence of volunteers' contribution, it's mainly related to relevance and reliability. The study argues that volunteers' contribution does not get reported in the financial reports, even though there is relevance for the reporting. The survey from this study found that most of the organizations said that it's too difficult to evaluate volunteers' contribution and the cost of recording. A significant portion of the respondents say that they do not record volunteers' contributions since they do not have control over them, and 50% of the respondents said that the service of volunteers was non-essential and immaterial. So that's one of the examples that as in what they say. Now, ANZTSR, there are other guidance from the Canadian Institute of Chartered Accountants and then FASB. All are sort of not similar, but close in nature in terms of what guidance to be. But all those, again, at the end of the day, it's I suppose difficult for the non-profit organizations to actually go for a valuation. So, in a recent study, I think what the literature has done is they have gone deeper to understand the actual merit for the valuation. So, would the valuation actually do any sort of particular benefit to the stakeholders? Like, for suppose if I'm a donor and I'm putting in money in an organization, obviously there are costs like contributing and everything, but At the end of the day, if I see the value in the financial report, does it actually help me in making any decision? And the same goes for, let's say, board of directors, because they're responsible for accountability, transparency, and at the end of the day, if there is a valuation there, I'm not saying like a revenue or expense, but might as well be like an asset or something. If that can be done, the question is that if that helps you to make a decision, and if that's the case, then well, there is a merit to it. So the recent study by Ushigura and Alahan, they proposed a connection between the donor's perception of decision usefulness of financial statements and donation intentions. The study found a strong link between financial disclosures, which the donors perceive as decision useful, and an organizational reputation of reporting organizations. The study also found a close connection between the donor's perception of the reputation of a non-profit organization and the trust of their organizations. And finally, there is a strong connection between donors' trust in an organization and their attitude towards donation activities. So if your donors, they have certain trustworthiness or reliability on the financial reports, and that drives you towards making a decision to okay, make a donation activity or philanthropic activity. I guess that's sort of like a strong message that we could find. Although that was done based on like a holistic sort of view. So what I am trying to do here, based on the whole situation and what I do, I just wanted to take a further step and then just to see, taking a couple of case study organizations and the key stakeholders for those organizations, as in the donors and the board of directors. The main thing that we want to look at is, again, if this valuation activity that have any impact on the decision making. So, including volunteers' contribution in the financial reports impacts decision making of the key stakeholders, such as donors and board of directors. We are raising reliability and accountability. So, just probably taking it one step further, and then just to see if those case study organizations research makes similar sort of outcome as the one that Ushi has done and Icon has done. It's based on accountability. So again, because if accountability is linked with the trustworthiness that is generated for the donors, then well, probably there would be a decision making impact. So from two folds, one is that on the donor side is that they contribute finance directly to the organization. So obviously there's a bit of accountability requirements from donors end, and then from board of directors, and it's at the end of the day they're responsible for accountability. So because certain amount you take from donors and then you spend certain amount of it into the management and administration for the volunteers. So there is a bit of accountability issue there as well. So from these two folds, we want to see whether the donor and board of directors perceive volunteers' contribution as an important distributing element, while believing that including volunteers' contribution may enhance accountability and legitimacy. Again, as I said in the beginning, that I'll be really open for some feedbacks, because this is an ongoing research, and I believe there will be certain changes, but at this stage, what we're trying to do is do a quantitative research. The good thing is we already have spoken with a couple of large non-profit organizations who are happy to we engaged with. One is Torbakov and the other one is down in Asia. They're large organizations, in millions, so their volunteer base is quite large as well. And what we will do is we will do a survey, and that survey will be done on a total of 200 samples, which includes the board of directors, which is coordinating member for both those two organizations, and the rest are donors for the as respondents. So the sample of donors will include, as I said, both organizations and individuals. In case of, because large organizations, they also have as in different organizations making donations. So in that case, would probably include the participants as in the highest authority responsible for taking decisions in those organizations. So at this stage, we are in the process of going forward and started the collection, and then obviously after that we'll see how it goes, and then get a collection. We'll do the data analysis and we'll see how it goes. So that's pretty much it actually on today. So yep, that's all it is.
And questions at the end, so perhaps if you'd like to. Sure. So Marion. Oh, she's down in the sessions with it. There she is. Okay, now Marion, I'm not sure if you can hear me, but I'm actually going to get the 5-minute warning sent to you by way of a typed message. I don't know how easy it would be for you to see that. We can't hear you at the moment, you're muted.
Can you hear me now?
We can now, yes.
Good.
So if you want to share your slides.
Yeah, I've tried to do that. I'm not familiar with Teams, but I think they're actually up already.
At the moment, we can't see them, so let's just see if we can get them back up.
All right, I'll stop the sharing.
Yes, I think we're right. So whenever you're ready, Marion.
Oh, okay, so you can see them?
We can, yes. Thank you.
Ah, lovely. Thanks, Megan. Sounds like you guys are having a great time over there. Really sorry I couldn't make it, but I've got my thesis submission due in a month, so time is of the essence. But anyway, so tonight the slides look very strange colour. I'm not used to presenting on Teams, and I'll just actually get the hang of this. So my research is on the social capital of not-for-profit directors. The presentation is thinking with heads and hearts. So just to run quickly through my research questions, and for some reason I ended up looking at the social capital, Bourdieu's social capital, and the concepts that he had of cultural and social capital. And so the first question is understanding how that actually has assisted the understanding that's come out of the research that I did. Second question is, what do non-executives gain from their involvement? And I'm going to concentrate on that today because actually I'm just at the stage of writing that up. Why do non-executive directors continue to serve on not-for-profit boards? And the fourth question, we had a discussion this afternoon whether or not that will remain, but that's another story about whether or not it's mission-driven is impacted by the non-executive directors. But then the final question is a so what question. How is the not-for-profit disability service sector in Australia context reconceptualised in terms of Bourdieu's framework? So just walking you through the main discussions, the issue that I'm actually dealing with is strategic cognition, which is, in layman's terms, is strategic thinking, and how this is actually able to be. Can you hear me all right? I'm getting a lot of feedback. So
We can hear you.
okay. So strategic cognition is strategic thinking, and it is actually a term that's used to try and encapsulate really the cognitive perspective in management. So it's about making sense of the strategy, less so than the how-to and the implementation and all the other things. It is the conceptualization of strategy with the concept of strategic cognition. The second element, of course, becomes that Bourdieu actually looks at three things. He looks at fields, social capital, and habitus. So that's actually the framework that you need to follow. So the interesting thing about this, of course, looking at it from this framework, is that when you actually look at the field that you're involved in, then what you can do is actually get the spirit or the sense of the game that's going on, which really is sort of an appealing way to look at what's happening and understanding in the fields. So looking at, the rules of the game and the sense of what actually happens in the field was important, but more important was that these are commercial directors that move into the not-for-profit sector. So we've actually got two fields and what's actually happening in between. So the fields, of course, obviously are, civil society, etc., moving down. I ended up with two organisations that I was mainly studying, both based here in Sydney. But importantly, over time, these particular networks on the right-hand side here came along. The Australian Institute of Company Directors, Women on Boards, for example, ACNC, and where that actually sort of, whether or not you can actually term it a network, etc. But certainly the National Disabilities Service. And also the second one that I was interested in having a look at was the Ability First Australia, which is a conglomeration of former crippled children's associations. So they have clustered together now in what's called Ability First Australia. So that, if you like, is the fields and the context of what I actually have had a look at. And also grappled very much with Bourdieu. If you're going to research social capital, is definitely the hardest version of it. So he actually forms or talks about three types of capital, less so the economic capital, but more about cultural capital, institutionalised in the form of educational qualifications, etc. The interesting form of cultural capital here is, of course, the awards that people get when they serve on these boards. So when a company director serves on a board, they will not get Order of Australia or AMs or whatever it is simply for the job that they do, but they will get those awards for serving on these not-for-profit boards. So if you actually have a look at the cultural capital that comes with that, some might say it's a skeptic's view, but that's actually the path to get the AM and OAM awards. And the last, of course, is the social capital, which is the obligations convertible to something into, if not economic capital, then what else? Bourdieu talks about institutionalised in the form of a title of nobility. And if you could actually sort of classify company directors as actually sort of having that sort of a title. So they are a very elite and powerful group within society. The difficult issue becomes there's methodology issues with using Bourdieu, but the one very good framework is to have a look at the concept of the habitus. And the habitus is put together by, it actually is described by dispositions. So you actually have a look at the dispositions that are attributed to the particular fields in which one has been placed throughout life. So it's actually about having a knowledge of the whole trajectory of your life trajectory. Some call it life history, but Bourdieu definitely talks about a life trajectory, where it's come from, what happened, etc. So this actually becomes the habitus, an understanding of our life trajectory, and the second property constituting stimulus itself. So what is it that actually drives us to use social capital? So it's actually sort of talking about the unconscious. He talks about the unconscious and conscious elements of habitus that actually stimulates us to decide what is actually driving us forward in terms of the life trajectory. So my interest has been always in why these company directors or why company directors serve unremunerated, apart from the cultural capital, which is important. And so that's actually the question that's been burning a hole in me for many, many years. What I've done is I've actually looked at, when I'm looking at the habitus of these directors, then I actually put it down as to deciding 4 criteria. It's acquired dispositions. So what are the dispositions in the fields that people operate? You do have to have a level of practical mastery, and this can be very contentiously beneath the level of consciousness, so, and discourse, of course. But so there is actually an unconscious element to what is actually going on, which also becomes difficult to research. But these sets of dispositions, they might vary by social location and trajectory, and also there are behavioural and cognitive structures that make up. And they're malleable and they're transmissible. And you have to undertake pedagogical work or work of some kind to gain those dispositions. Sorry, I'm having a struggle because it's very scratchy over here, but anyway. So in finding this out, I've sort of been through the wilds of methodology and got involved in snowball sampling, demographic data, life histories. There's actually a whole new school coming out on life history research and how that's actually to be undertaken. So it's actually fascinating. With the semi-structured interviews, I ended up forming narrative inquiry, thematic analysis with Lexi Manser initially. And then I actually sort of, that's where I came to a full stop with Bourdieu, and then I adopted the concept of storytelling. So it's also supported by, you know, social constructionist perspective as well, which was, if you can categorise Bourdieu as anything, that's where he sits. The other comment before we get into the detail quickly is the positionality. This was actually, I fell into, I didn't deliberately chase a fraternal network. So my brothers, I ended up entering into my brother's network, but it was also into the world of Rotary. I felt I'm a Rotarian myself, etc. So I had to discuss about sort of all those sorts of levels of positionality. So the second director here that was referred to me was somebody that knew my brother not overly well, but that actually becomes important in gaining access to elites. So we were part of the same network, etc. So originally I actually, this director here, he actually recommended off to the director too. And then I ended up with a major sample and the support of the chair of another organisation, etc. Not terribly much support from the first, but it wasn't too bad. So it was definitely snowball, what you could classify as snowball sampling. So some of the questions, importantly, the struggle with Bourdieu's version of social capital. How does it tend to clarify or assist in understanding the driving question of why these directors did it? And I have to say it's actually been very useful. So this is a mind map. You don't have to follow it, but it's actually an ability to put the fields on the outside and actually have a look at the habitus at the core, and the rest of it becomes social capital. The only other issue, of course, becomes the possible symbolic violence around the commercialisation of the disability services, etc. So when you actually sort of frame it and actually have the large frameworks and lenses that Bourdieu allows to you, it actually sort of led me to sort of a graphical understanding of what was actually sort of happening in this space, because this is all happening in the context of networks. So it was very useful, and it allowed me to understanding what the links were between social capital and strategic cognition or strategic thinking. And it's allowed to have a different view of what is actually happening in the development and ongoing of strategic cognition. Now, I'll actually spend most of the time just walking through the next slides, and then I'll pretty much finish off because this is the interesting part. I'm actually writing it up at the moment. So when I looked at this, I said, okay, what exactly is the data telling me in terms of what's the important learning that goes on here in the context of strategic thinking? And if you look at the frameworks, etc., around them, these are the key areas that came out. The commercialisation process, not historically, but you've actually got, and this is actually looking at what the themes were, whether or not, it's difficult to transpose these things, whether or not they're related to commercial or not-for-profit thinking. And the third is an area that I've actually called the third space, which is what's actually happening in change of the strategic thinking, etc. So with the commercialisation process, while and all they're very comfortable with it, obviously in the commercial world, historically within this, there hasn't been terribly much commercialisation going on. So there's an exposure to that sort of change process, if you like, in the context of these not-for-profits. Business model change, when we've actually got corporate social responsibility and all of the discussions we're having at this conference around different business models and hybrid business models, etc., and the application and the relevance they actually have for the provision of certain services. I just happen to be in the space of disability services. And so it has a lot to do, obviously, with corporate social responsibility and the business model changes that are going on. So when you're actually sort of looking at the commercial world, business model change is an inevitability. But the concept is that necessarily the case in the not-for-profit sector? The next one, which is mergers and acquisitions, that was the interesting thing that a lot of the directors were interested in observing and learning about, because the disability services was going to undertake or be subject to a lot of merger and acquisitions. And so the directors felt that this was going to be very useful in their competitive space. but the framework was actually sort of different. The mergers and acquisitions are said to be more collaborative in the not-for-profit sector. So, but they were still greatly interested in learning about all of that in an almost safe space. Organisational size and growth, of course, is important and it's a critical element of strategy. Organisation growth isn't necessarily part of not-for-profit sector. And so these companies have actually grown 6 times since I started my research. So they have gone from, 6 million a year, etc., or 60 million to 300 plus million in the period of the NDIS. So significant corporate growth has occurred, which happens in the commercial sector, but very large disability service organisations are emerging from this. They also learn about mission-driven strategy and all of the stakeholder issues, etc., that go on. Strategic innovation is an interesting one because what they said was that it was actually less risky to innovate strategically in the not-for-profit. So they were actually sort of interested in learning about strategic innovation, etc., which was much more difficult to achieve in the commercial world than the not-for-profit. Joint ventures, of course, very critical in the implementation of the NDIS. Service provision and operational understanding, there's still lots of debates, etc., but the small margins around disability service at the time when this all took off was around about 2%. They have increased. Government relations, a big part of what these directors are interested in learning. And lobbying, etc. The government is also an important part of what the directors are interested in learning. The other comments are open strategy, information technology also played a part in people discussing what was going to be important and what they were going to be learning about because these organisations tend to be much more open in terms of social media. Also stakeholder involvement, which is being, an important part of strategy all up, but learning more about the stakeholders and how you can actually involve the stakeholders or relate to stakeholders in terms of strategy was an important learning. Cultural capital. Yep.
I'm just reaching the end of your time.
Yep. I'll finish this
slide. Yep, thank you.
Okay, good. And of course, the other interesting things that they learned about was cultural capital, strategic thinking, and also networking, etc. So I'll just finish off because these are the interesting things because the benefit is quite large. Leadership development and also diversity development. So there is an awful lot of learning going on with these directors, etc., which I think becomes an important issue when you're actually looking at value, because the value they get from these positions is quite large. Sorry, Megan.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
I'm sure people will have questions for you later, but we're now going to move to our third presenter.
Okay.
And so if you turn off your microphone and we'll ask Goran to
Stop sharing.
He's on. Yeah.
Good.
Can you all hear me?
Yes, we can.
Excellent. And can you see my presentation? It's my main question.
Yeah. Yes, yeah. And it's just gone on to presentation mode, so that's great.
Excellent.
A minute warning through the chat, Goran.
Yes, please. Thank you, Megan, and good afternoon, everybody. I'm Goran Torbakov. I'm a PhD candidate and student from Murdoch University, and I'm presenting my systematic literature review that I've completed as part of my PhD research. And the systematic literature review, or the name of the paper for this conference, is Strategic Decision-Making Processes for Ethno-specific and Multicultural Third Sector Organizations. And as I said, I'm reporting on the systematic literature review. I would like to acknowledge, I'm sorry, I can actually hear a lot of banging in my ears. So I'm not quite sure whether somebody is moving next to the, but it's very distracting.
How about now?
Okay, that's better. Thank you. Excellent. Thank you. I also would like to acknowledge my supervisors, my mentors, and the two magnificent academics who became my second family, and that's Dr. Ingrid O'Brien and Dr. Megan Paull. And also, I know that we are conducting this conference at WA University, but I'm biased. I would like to acknowledge the Wajik people of the Noongar Nation as traditional custodians of the country and the waters that Murdoch University stands, and Noongar country. We pay our respects to Noongar elders past and present and acknowledge their wisdom and advice in our teaching and cultural knowledge activities. Now, to start, it was kind of a bit of a journey for me, needing to do my literature review, and obviously various options were opened. However, I opted for systematic literature review simply because it had a bit of a, an added structure to it. It also throughout the initial literature review, I kind of came to realize that the area that I'm researching, it's very narrow, and the elimination of bias seems to be less, I guess, less noticeable, less in a listed term when a systematic literature review is conducted. So I opted for the systematic literature review, and the sources and the types of literature that I actually look at: for-profit organizations, ethno-specific not-for-profit organizations in the HK space, entrepreneurship, decision-making, and priority and longevity. To actually, I guess, touch base very briefly on the significance and importance of this for many in the sector, and for many scholars and academics, and specifically people who are also in the HK sector. Sustainable entrepreneurship, it's a bit of an unknown area, and I want to confirm that sustainable entrepreneurship, or what I mean with sustainable entrepreneurship, is an entrepreneurship that it's able to be sustained for the longevity of the organization. So I wanted to make that distinction, as sustainability can sometimes mean something totally different. Value creation for the organization, market competition, board capacity and capabilities, strategic transformation, which in this day and age, with all the changes that organizations are going through, it's extremely important, and also customer choice, which is something that the industry and the funding bodies are continuously pushing through their funding arrangements with the HK providers. Now, the exploring and overarching question that I looked at in my systematic literature review is what qualitative research has been done to date about how HK ethno-specific and multicultural not-for-profit organizations in Australia are determining their priorities to ensure their entrepreneurial sustainability and longevity. And it's very important to note at this point in time that I also looked at other countries or other geographical areas apart from Australia, given that some of the developed, or majority of the developed countries already have some kind of a different, and maybe in certain cases advanced models of the actual, I guess, the narrative that I was looking for, or covering my qualitative research question. And I guess really one of the fundamental issues that it's facing the HK sector today is the growing population of the older people. And as I said earlier, the right of choice when they make their decision, okay? And the literature, the worldwide literature that actually has emerged speaks in details on priority settings and argues that existing resources are getting scarce and less available to the healthcare industry. And that causes enormous pressure, obviously, on their governance and in the management priorities. The evidence also suggests that ethnicity as a theory includes cultural, religious, and national identities, people from different ethnic backgrounds, customs, and languages, which further separates the Australians into three groups based on the advocacy for multiculturalism and so forth. And I guess what's the significance about my research really is that even in the preliminary research, in the testing literature research, and also in preparing my confirmation for candidature, many of these themes emerged as something that the industry is grappling with. To further, I think, elaborate on how I went and how I actually did the systematic literature review, I adopted examining peer review academic journals and various grey literature, and that's, I think, the methodology that I have adopted. I've also conducted the systematic literature review following JBI methodology for systematic reviews and qualitative evidence, and used their tool to basically evaluate each and every one of the chosen articles and journals that emerged as part of the overall review. And that was done by in two major business management databases, which are Source Complete and ABI Inform. I've considered qualitative studies that explore entrepreneurial decision-making in not-for-profit, ethno-specific and multicultural organization in Australia. As I said, peer-reviewed academic journals, various grey literature, government reports, policies, and other sources recognized as providing valuable insight. I had first considered the aged care in Australia, then examined the not-for-profit organizations, and specifically considering ethno-specific not-for-profit organizations. And as I said, thinking back about the systematic literature review, I chose this method really because it allowed me to test theory, replication of the actual bias or the researcher bias. Following the I think the methodology and really the search into the database, I then came to using their tool or JBI tool, which it was an absolutely interesting journey. In matter of fact, I spent a substantial amount of time trying to even learn how to, I think, perfect the analysis and the assessment of the articles and the journals and the literature. And I adopted, or I guess I followed, the three stages of a critical appraisal. So the first stage really is the identification of the records by searching the databases that are closely matching the research design. I identified 374,000 records who were retrieved from the database, and 94 records from the registers. The second stage was a stage of screening, and basically out of the 374 and the 94, identified 395 records They were assessed based on their individual title and abstract, and 86 records were identified as suitable for a full text screening out of the 395. The third stage of the methodology or the critical appraisal is the analysis, and that included studies by completing a full text screening based on the JBI database critical appraisal result. They were grouped according to their article research approach and methodology, and there were two categories. Basically, qualitative research and text opinion category. And I guess looking at the complexity of the research questions during the preliminary testing, it emerged that current peer review literature does not offer the breadth and depth of answering these key elements of the study, which subsequently are confirmed by the knowledge gap. So in order to reach the saturation, the data saturation, excuse me, it was decided to expand the literature search for text and opinion articles that maybe offer some insight into the research paradigm. Excuse me. A sip of water. My apology. The analysis then showed that all of the authors have industry expertise and are well-regarded experts in that particular area. The characteristics of the studies that emerged is basically they're grouped by this methodology into 5 groups. So methods for data collection and analysis. There were 18 peer review. The countries that were covered, basically there was 19 studies from Australia, 7 from the United States, and 1 study from Lithuania and 1 from New Zealand. Phenomenon of interest, out of all the studies, 11 studies showed not-for-profit organizations, 7 showed aged care and older people, 8 studies showed ethnic and multicultural theory, and 2 studies entrepreneurial and sustainability. The participants' characteristics and the sample size, 18 studies out of all had a very limited participant information, and 10 studies had various participant characteristics and sample size. And the description of the main results was really the not-for-profit organizations developing new way of doing business in the way of sustainability and innovation. Non-for-profit organization adopting a forward-thinking approach to service provision, sustainability-led value proposition, and government funding based on merit by language, culture, and ethnicity of clients and their needs. So really, in a big synthesis of the data for both the qualitative studies and the text and opinion studies, it shows a pattern of themes that are already known and to an extent researched within the current empirical evidence that exists in the body of knowledge. Okay, they incorporated the need for the not-for-profit organizations to develop, as I said, a new ways to actually do business, given the pressures that they continuously feel within the sector, to actually have a more sustainable value proposition. And for the funding bodies, as I said, to take a real, considerable approach towards, I guess, the funding model that thinks about or considers ethnicity, language, culture, and multiculturalism when those funds are appropriated to the organizations. Basically, the findings of the review of the systematic literature review, or the themes that emerged, are the aged care participants language and culture barriers, the government funding collaboration, government policy implications. There is also which is culturally appropriate linguistic communities, and a couple of more which are also ethnicity and caregiving or caregivers. These were really the themes that that emerged based on the that I guess came out of the systematic literature review. And I think as important as anything, the knowledge gap that emerged out of this systematic literature review or the findings is that there is a lack of consideration for funding bodies for ethnic, cultural, and linguistic needs. And during the detailed synthesis and analysis of the literature, many of the scholars and industry experts' arguments that formed part of this systematic literature all mind when they were talking about a consideration and some of the discussed paradigms regarding the sector and the industry. So that was basically something that it was a notion in all of the scholars in the industry. Ethnicity also emerged as a part of the decision-making processes, and the entrepreneurship sustainability in the sector is really, it's the top area that emerged as an area that really requires further investigation. Okay, and I guess one of the interesting things that kind of emerged from all the literature reviews was that the current operation, funding, and governance models for profit organizations, the HK space, are looking at the funding envelope as, I guess, that it fits all the organization, but that is something that I think has proven, or at least has shown as a gap within the knowledge by this systematic literature review. And as I mentioned, further research may open the opportunity for discovery of additional critical knowledge that it's really important not only to the participants in the HK sector, to the industry as a whole, but also to governments and funding bodies who actually benefit from knowing that the industry has an opportunity to be entrepreneurial and have a sustainable future within the HK industry. That is basically my bibliography, and I want to thank you for listening and for your attention. Thank you.
Thank you. So, Marion, we invite you to put your camera and mic back on, and Goran, stop sharing. Thank you very much. I don't know, Shuvo, whether you might be better off down the front there next to them so that we can address our questions to you all. Does anybody have a question for any of our presenters? I think we can all agree that it's been interesting, even though some of the technology challenges have made it. Yeah.
I had one question, which is probably mainly for Marion, and that is, if there is such value for non-executive directors sitting on non-profit boards, we often get worried about people being scared off sitting on boards because of the liability that they're going to take on by meeting the high expectations that we set. But what you're saying is there's another driver pushing them onto those boards. I'm just sort of wondering if this is starting to get you, or whether you started thinking about, should we be less worried about scaring people off due to the liability associated with the high standards we expect because of the cultural capital that they're receiving?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, one of the questions becomes, are these positions becoming very unattractive, which is one way of looking at it. But so much is gained by these individuals on these boards that yeah, what you're sort of saying is that it's not just the risk levels, etc., but it actually is, there is a lot to be gained in terms of social capital and cultural capital. Yeah, absolutely.
Thank you.
Could I follow that up, Marion, and ask you about the debate about paying not-for-profit board members? We've moved up to almost getting close to 30%, I think. Our boards are paying something. What's your view on that? And are we throwing good money away that ought to be applied to the front line?
Yeah, do you want my personal opinion? My personal opinion is, for example, the Macquarie Bank has young people being trained on these boards. It's a training ground for young consultants, and they pay, or the last I knew, they actually paid the not-for-profit $10,000 to have these people on their board. And given the benefits, not only in terms of the learning, but also in terms of the people's view of who they are when they serve on these boards, one could almost come to the conclusion that, yes, they shouldn't have expenses, but there is oftentimes such great value that exceeds any possible remuneration. So remuneration is not necessarily the issue, but it's not, that's not just clear, that's just in perspective of how Bourdieu would look at it in terms of developing vertical and horizontal social capital.
Thank you. Do we have any other questions for our?
Sorry, I didn't catch your name.
Shuvo.
Shuvo. I am Bernard. I was interested in talking about whether or not would the value of volunteers that they contribute in money terms onto the balance sheet. And there are a lot of organisations, like there's lots of costs associated with volunteers as well, like training and induction. And do the costs go onto the balance sheets at the moment? Do you think if they did, well then?
Yes, some of the organisations, I believe the relatively larger ones, they sometimes report it, but it's like an overhead cost kind of a thing. So yes, they do. Yeah, so that goes to the financial reports rather than the overhead cost mainly. But yeah, very rarely they report like what are the numbers they have in terms of how many volunteers we have, how many hours that put in, and all those things. It's rare.
Yes, I have a question for Goran. A technical question, really. I'm curious. I've done a couple of systematic reviews, but I was interested in your flow diagram. Two aspects of it, but what caught my eye was what you described as an automated, and I can't recall the right words, screening process. But related to that was the rapid diminution from, I think, 300,000 records to, and again, I can't recall, but probably it was in the order, wasn't it, of 300. So, you know, what was that automated process? It's not something that I've been familiar with. Can you give a little bit of can you flesh that out about and give a little bit of a description of the technology or the software that undertook that process?
Okay, I have to actually take the camera off because I was told that apology about that. So thank you for the question. I'm not quite sure that I've had an automated process in my presentation. I might have mentioned that I've used JBI Hi-Fi, but the JBI systematic literature review tool, I've only used based on the 369 articles, but from the 360 something thousand that actually emerged, that was actually what came about from the databases. So obviously I then used a special or the databases additional screening opportunities, such as you can filter by the or the country or whatever, and then they actually I brought them down to 369. I wasn't doing the 360,000 in the JBI, that's for sure. So you're right, there is nothing automated about it.
He's talking about the application of the filters from
Yes.
the search down.
Yeah,
I think
no,
it's just
thank you,
the way-
Goran. Thank you. No, that clarifies. I thought perhaps there was some magic technique that I hadn't yet discovered. Unfortunately, no.
No. I must admit, to be honest, I looked at it, and creating something for automation purposes, but time was not permitting. So maybe in another life, I'll be able to do that.
Tell me about it. Discover it.
Can I ask Goran a
Thank
question?
you. I will definitely.
Sorry, we've got 2 questions in the room and Marion on the screen. I might go to Marion first if that's okay. Yeah, Marion?
Yep, I was actually fascinated, Goran. I was comfortable with everything I saw in relationship to aged care. When I see entrepreneurship, there sort of was a bit of a disconnect between aged care and why we're discussing entrepreneurship. I was wondering if you could elaborate a little bit on the context of the entrepreneurship we're talking about here.
Thank you, Marion. A very good question. So the context of the entrepreneurship, it really relates to the boards and management, decision-making processes for the longevity of the organization. In matter of fact, I guess I'm really looking at specifically ethno-specific multicultural organizations and their decision-making processes, I guess in the scope of whether they are considering the ethnicity or multiculturalism when they make decisions, and whether those decisions, regardless of the outcome, will be a sustainable decisions on the long run. So that is the entrepreneurial approach that many not-for-profit organizations, there was an interesting thing that you had in your presentation when you said boards like to be innovative, okay?
Yeah.
And that they like innovation because there is less risk. There's less risk for them. Well, my literature review speaks the contrary, and many organizations in the aged care space are very reluctant to be innovative and entrepreneurial, because that puts them outside of the scope of all the regulative compliance framework, and they don't have time for it. They are literally scared that the moment they are entrepreneurial, that will affect their compliance and they will be outside the game.
And rightly so.
So we have
Yes.
2 more questions in 5 minutes, so I'm going to keep moving. I hope that's okay. We might go here first and then to Ian, if that's okay.
Yeah, sure. Marion, I had a question for you just about the approach and the how it relates to social capital, because you're talking about, I guess, the things that the people on the boards are interested in learning. And for me, that is less of a social capital and more of a, I guess, an intellectual or a knowledge-based capital. And so I was just wondering whether you'd looked at, I guess, different ways of thinking about social capital from a relational point of view, like the bonding or bridging relationships, and what those people on the boards and the boards and the organisations themselves might get out of those experiences. So rather than just the individual, I learned about this thing, if that makes sense.
Yes, absolutely. It's important in social capital. And we just looked today at a very small part of my findings. So yes, the bonding and bridging, etc. The discussion of the networks is important. It's critical. We call them director interlocks. It's critical within this type of research as to how the social capital moves about as well. I don't know if that answered the question.
Yeah, pretty much.
Thank you. And Ian?
And then, so a quick one for Goran. I was sort of curious at the number of Australian studies, and I was sort of wondering if, maybe that's the database. maybe there's some other reason, but I wouldn't have expected that many Australian studies to come up. And then I was wondering if part of that was, I'm not sure Australia is progressive, but whether, is that because there are some First Nations studies? I mean, there's some crossover with, multicultural and ethno-specific organisations. If you're sort of looking at, I'm sure there's a fair bit of research in the First Nations space in Australia and other places that the sorts of processes and decision-making processes for boards. Anyway, sorry, it's probably two questions all rolled into one, Goran.
Yes, thank you. Another very, very interesting and good question, because the reason, I guess you've actually answered your own question. The reason for having so many is because there has been a lot of work done in the sphere of Indigenous and especially ethnic or multicultural communities, and this is, I guess, what actually emerged, as I previously said in the presentation. He actually confirms the notion of the fact that the literature that actually emerged is talking about various aspects of non-for-profit and ethnicity. However, it's not actually addressing what I'm looking for, and that is more on entrepreneurial decision-making processes. So this is why I had quite a lot Australian articles or papers. But another thing is that, yes, I was really doing, the databases is probably more concentrated on Australian literature, and hence those Australian that Australian literature emerged.
Yes. Okay, thank you. Does anyone have one quick last question, or shall we call it a day? Please join me in thanking our three presenters.
Thanks, Megan.
Thank you.
Thank you, Megan.
Thank you.
The team's meeting as well. So thank you very
Everybody.
much.
Bye. Thank you.
Thank you. See you later.
Bye.
Bye-bye.